Apologies for that, everyone. I had my microphone muted. We are back with another episode of the Kyle Lanslown Show, and today joining me is Ambassador Ian Proud. He was a member of His Majesty's Diplomatic Service from 1999 to 2023, which I mean, I gotta imagine a very interesting set of years to be a diplomat. I mean, this is the post Cold War era, the kind of terror war era, but really the time we see the relationship between the US and I mean the West in general and Moscow completely dissolve. And you actually served in the British embassy in Moscow from July of 2024 to February of 2019. And so, Ambassador Proud, I really can't even get past your bio without asking you just your general assessment of how the relationship between London, Washington, and then Moscow changed over the years that you were in the diplomat service.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks, Carl. It's great to be on the show. Firstly, I wasn't ambassador to Moscow, so Ian is just fine. So I arrived at the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. And actually, it's a place I wanted to go just a year before. I'd seen Vladimir Putin in the United Kingdom for the G8 summit in Lough Erne, which is in Northern Ireland. I'd organised that summit. So going to Russia was a good next step, as Russia was due to host. And of course, everything happened that we knew happened. But I mean, I think the key change for me was actually the decision quite early on after the Ukraine crisis started in early 2014 for the UK government and actually also the US government at the time, under President Obama, to stop or to reduce to the greatest extent possible dialogue with Russia. And that's a legacy we see today, where there's a real reluctance, particularly in European states, less so now that Trump's in power. He's very much keen on dialogue, but certainly the Brits and the Europeans are still clinging on to this idea that we can somehow resolve things in Ukraine without actually talking to Putin.
Right. And then on your bio at the Proud Diplomat, which fantastic name for a website. You're really good. Your Substack name is also the Peacemonger. Again, a very good name. So people should definitely check out your site, subscribe to you because your work is fantastic. We'll actually be linking to your Substack article at antiwar.com later this week. But you mentioned that you were the person who authorized around half of UK sanctions against Russia, and you consider the sanctions to have backfired and that the West needs to overhaul its policy with Russia. And so, two questions from that statement. I'm interested, did you support the sanctions when you were initially approving them? And then what caused you to change your mind about supporting them?
Well, my dog in the background clearly has an opinion on sanctions too, but I never really kind of believed that sanctions was the right approach, to be honest. But that was my job. When you commit to public service, you do your job and so on. I mean, it's easy to use that as an excuse. But I was there really to kind of monitor the effectiveness of sanctions and give advice to UK government ministers, at the time. And it's quite clear early on that sanctions weren't having an effect. What they were doing was actually prompting Russia towards this kind of self-sufficiency drive that we see today, 10 years on, 11 years on, in fact, from sanctions first being introduced against Russia. Russia's economy is now performing better than the economies of Europe. That process of adaptation has taken place for 11 years, already. And the thing about sanctions is actually, nobody's ever really reviewing the effectiveness or otherwise of them. They become an end in themselves, even though they're not working, even though they're actually driving deindustrialization within Europe itself because of super high energy prices. People have totally lost contact with reality on sanctions, and Russia is now surging ahead and pivoting towards Asia, and actually back to the US as well, of course, under President Trump.
Yeah, and so now I want to kind of bring us up to today. Just this past weekend, I feel like we've had a lot of interesting developments in the Trump-led efforts to broker an end to the war in Ukraine. And one of the things that happened that was should have been the most important was the meeting between Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Vladimir Putin. It was another 3-hour meeting where both sides say that progress was made. But shortly before that, there was what the Kremlin is calling a terrorist attack, a car bombing in Moscow that killed a lieutenant general in an area just outside of Moscow. And so then this captures major headlines. Of course, then we have this photo op or sit down between Trump and Zelensky in the Vatican. And then Trump really quickly appears to change his tune, where before he's saying we're very close to getting a deal done with Russia, and now he's warning Putin and saying that Putin might not be sincere about negotiations. And so I'm interested, from your time, working in the diplomat service and being in Moscow, what do you think of Trump's negotiation strategy here, and how do you think it's going to play with the Russians?
Well, I think when you scratch below the surface, it's quite clear that Trump is actually investing a lot of effort in a rebooted US-Russia relationship. There are huge commercial benefits to the US from that, and the US doesn't want to bang for forever war in Ukraine. I mean, that much is clear. Trump changes his surface messaging, but when you look at the way the US is voting in, for example, the United Nations, or he's voting alongside with Russia, which is quite a remarkable kind of change of affairs. The tone in terms of the dialogue with Witkoff now meeting Putin 4 times is really quite striking. Yes, of course, Zelensky and Trump met briefly in the Pope's funeral, but I get the impression that actually Trump is very much more invested in the reboot with Russia and wants to kind of ditch the Ukraine war as soon as he possibly can. Everything else is just noise, from my reading of it. You've gone muted again.
Apologies, I mute myself there. So, one of my concerns, I would like to see this war ended. One of my real concerns that could foil Trump's effort to end the war in Ukraine is that the Europeans don't seem to be willing to go along, and the European leadership is doing everything they can to try to extend this war in Ukraine. So if Trump does attempt to wash his hands of this, if he doesn't continue to give Ukraine support once the congressionally authorized funding for US support ends, what is Europe going to do? Do you think they're going to try to fill in the US role in this proxy war?
Well, I don't think they can. I don't think they can afford to. Even Trump's drive to get US nations to spend 3%, 4%, 5% of GDP on defense. European leaders can't even afford that. This idea of this reassurance force, peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Even the Brits are backing away from that now. Britain and France would struggle to muster 30,000 troops between them in circumstances where there are kind of 800,000 Ukrainian troops and 600,000 Russian troops apparently sort of in Ukraine. So, I mean, there's limited scope for the Europeans to do anything without American financial and military support. But I think actually the threat of the US walking away under President Trump will actually be the cold shower that this stalemate, which is essentially what we're in at the moment, kind of really needs. I think it's whenever Trump makes a really bold move, I think that's when you see movement on Zelensky's side and on the European side. In between, you get the status quo tends to really freeze, and it's Trump needs to, I think, be more active and actually kind of really pushing the Europeans to get on board with this, because they can't afford to sustain the war, and it's just making Ukraine an increasingly failed state.
Yeah, I 100% agree with your assessment there. James Carden, who was in the U.S. diplomatic service, until recently, has a really interesting article out saying that Trump needs to Europeanize the war, basically arguing that we just need to go to the European Union and tell them, you got 2 months, you have 3 months, but then the U.S. intelligence support, the U.S. military support, it's going to end. And at that point, the Europeans will realize that we can maybe do this for a couple months, but not indefinitely. Yeah. And then we'll have to go down the road to peace. So I guess, how far do you think Europe would escalate? I mean, we've had, certainly France, I think, lead the way in suggesting putting French troops into Ukraine, not necessarily on the front lines, but to fill military roles so more Ukrainians could go to the front. We've heard about maybe British or French peacekeepers if a ceasefire is met. Do you think Europe decides that, no, we can't let Ukraine lose, and then starts to send troops and gets directly involved in the war?
I don't actually, and I actually read James' article just before coming on your show, Carl. I'm lucky enough to meet James for dinner in London a couple of months ago. Really great guy, really good analysis, and I agree with his article, completely. But no, the Europeans can't One of the problems with the Europeans is that there are kind of 27 countries in the EU and the UK, and it's like that kind of proverbial game of chess. You can't play chess by committee. The Europeans can never agree on any decisive course of action. They blow a lot of hot air, they generate a lot of steam and indignation about how bad it is and how we need to, support Ukraine forever, but they can't afford to do it, and they don't have the troops to actually kind of provide a meaningful deterrent. So actually, they have to get on board. So the Europeanization, the normalization approach that James Carden recommends, I completely align myself with it.
Right. I thought that was brilliant analysis. And I actually asked James, and he will be coming on this show on Wednesday. So if anybody wants to hear me speak with James Carden, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel so you catch that episode. Now, I want to go on and play this clip from Marco Rubio, who sounds, I think, fairly reasonable in his Sunday morning interview. So
we think we brought the sides closer than they've been in a very long time, but we're not there yet, and it needs to start happening. We need to start. I think this is going to be a very critical week. This week is going to be a really important week in which we have to make a determination about whether this is an endeavor that we want to continue to be involved in, or if it's time to sort of focus on some other issues that are equally, if not more important in some cases. But we want to see it happen. There are reasons to be optimistic, but there are reasons to be realistic, of course, as well. We're close, but we're not close enough.
So I am starting to think that when Rubio is talking about the U.S. is going to get out of this, he means that the U.S. is basically telling the Ukrainians, you got to wait to sign on to this deal, or you're going to lose U.S. support when it runs dry. Is that the way you understand Ambassador Rubio?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, he's trying to kind of nudge the Europeans and the Ukrainians, Zelensky in particular, into kind of the right window. And in fact, I agree with actually Secretary Rubio with what he says, that the sides have come closer together. You have seen competing European and US kind of proposals for the ceasefire. They do show some areas of alignment. They do show that actually NATO has been sort of taken off the table, for example. They do show a peace process starting from the line of control. So there are still huge areas of disagreement, of course, on security assurances, what they mean on the economic side and how that's going to be paid for. But it is possible actually to see in the different proposals being put forward that progress has been made. And I think that's very much attributable to the efforts that the US government has made here.
Well, one thing I would like to get your thoughts on is how important was that NATO membership for Ukraine and taking that off the table for Moscow? Because even now, you'll still have many people who defend this war in Ukraine and say it really wasn't about that. It was more, all these other issues like Russians' desire for territorial expansion. Do you think in 2021, 2022, when Russia is putting forward these proposals saying that if you take NATO membership off the Ukraine, and he also wanted some other, I think, rebalancing of power structures in Europe and things like that. But do you think that would have been enough to prevent the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, NATO has always been the issue that's been ignored really for 16 years, and more, right back to the Bucharest summit in 2008 that George W. Bush, went to, right back to the Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, right back to the Balts joining NATO in 2006. So, I mean, NATO has always been the issue. And when you take that off the table, everything else becomes a lot easier. The problem is, because the war's been running on for 3 years, some additional considerations have now come in, like what happens with the 4 oblasts that Russia has foolishly, in my view, kind of laid legal claim to since the war, has started, for example. What happens on, for example, the status of Russian minority languages in the rump of Ukraine? What happens with these kind of Ukrainian children, some of whom have been moved to Russia? So, I mean, NATO is the big issue, but war has thrown in all these other really, really complicated things too. But I mean, if you take NATO off the table, then the rest becomes a lot more tractable and easier to negotiate through, I believe.
So I'm just curious on, kind of your assessment of negotiations. We hear Russia maybe saying they're willing to stop their advance along the line of control. Would that be enough of an incentive to get Kiev to accept a deal? Or do you think the Ukrainians are really going to just press no territorial concessions whatsoever, even if they lose U.S. support?
Well, the line of control has been fairly static for quite a long time. I mean, it's the Russians are making small advances here and there around Turetsk at the moment. They've now reclaimed all of the territory of Kursk that was lost last August. But there are not any huge shifts happening on the line of control, right now. So now is a good time to kind of sue for peace. Quite frankly, people keep talking about a new kind of Russian offensive happening after the May Day celebration. Let's see, that may just be a bargaining chip. But they're not fighting for territory now. They just need to kind of sit down and talk. The line of control is what it is. It isn't moving very much. The Ukrainians don't have the troops to retake that territory, including Crimea. They just need to settle on that starting point for the peace process and move on and be in a Cyprus-type, West Germany-type situation.
Right. One of the things being advocated for a lot here in the US, I'm sure in Europe too, is that we need to put more pressure on Russia. And Donald Trump recently posted on Truth Social, maybe banking or secondary sanctions on Russia with a question mark. And so I'm just curious if your assessment, can the US, can the West put additional economic pressure on Russia with more sanctions or tariffs or, lowering the price cap on Russian oil? Throughout this entire war, Biden, had said that the Western sanctions were going to bring the Russian war machine to a grinding halt. There was even some concern that the price caps on Russian oil could be the equivalent of an economic nuclear weapon and really blow up the world markets. And quite frankly, they just haven't had much of an effect on the Russian economy at all, it seems.
Yeah, and Russia's the most sanctioned country on the planet now after 11 years of sanctions. People think of sanctions just since 2022. They've been in place since 2014, and all that time Russia's been adapting its economy to kind of live with sanctions. And it's had oil prices collapsing at various times. It's had a COVID pandemic, to deal with, and still it's growing faster than the Eurozone economies. So actually, people have to ask themselves, what additional pressure can new sanctions bring? And also, actually, all the biggest sanctions have been used already. What new measures do we think we can realistically pull out of the hat that would have more impact on the 20,000 plus sanctions already? And in terms of tariffs, how much trade do people think Russia does with the USA and with Europe now? Answer, hardly any. Tariffs is not really going to make any difference at all.
Yeah, one of the only proposals I've seen that I could imagine having any effect whatsoever is they're talking about trying to seize the ships that they claim are Russia's shadow fleet, the tankers that are moving the sanctioned Russian oil. And I think Latvia or Lithuania actually did detain one of those tankers. I mean, do you think this could have a major effect on the economic war?
They've been talking about the shadow fleet for a while, but if you look at the numbers for 2024, Russian export revenues were, higher than in 2023. I mean, there's absolutely no sign that, Russia is losing money from any of these measures that people are taking, whether it's kind of shadow fleet, whether it's kind of targeting particular, banks, whether it's targeting intermediary countries or anything else. We've tried everything, guys. I mean, maybe let's try peace. How about that? Let's give that a try instead.
Yeah. So I have a clip here from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he's talking about the potential for peace. And I want to play this clip for you.
If you want a ceasefire, just to continue supply arms to Ukraine, so what is your purpose? You know what Kaja Kallas and what's his name, Mark Rutte said about the
NATO
ceasefire,
Secretary General and the European Union.
They bluntly stated that they can support only the deal which at the end of the day will make Ukraine stronger, would make Ukraine a victor. So if this is the purpose of the ceasefire, I don't think this is what President Trump wants. This is what Europeans, together with Zelensky, want to make out of President Trump's initiative.
So here, I think Lavrov is talking about another place where maybe Trump could get trapped and to continually support the war in Ukraine. I think the hawks around him, particularly those like Marco Rubio and our national security advisor Mike Waltz, are telling Trump to put ceasefires on the table and to try to get Russia to accept the ceasefire. And on the face of it, that sounds like a fairly reasonable thing to do. But I think the Russian position is, look, we've agreed to ceasefires in the past, referring to the Minsk agreement, and Ukraine exploited that period to then rearm and to try to take over the Donbass region and to, reconquer that territory that Russia wanted to support their autonomy. And so, what do you think of Lavrov's demand here that I guess basically, we're not going to do a ceasefire, we're looking for a permanent end to the war?
Well, taking NATO off the table is one thing. If you do that and continue to pump billions of dollars of weapons into Ukraine, then it's still a kind of an issue from the the Russian point of view. I also think actually part of that should come down to the detailed negotiations of what the Ukrainian military looks like after any ceasefire. But I do still think that a ceasefire should come first, and we're really then getting into details about Ukraine's military in the future and so on. I don't think those negotiations should hold up a ceasefire now.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you on this one. I think if we don't have that ceasefire in place, things are going to continue to happen. Like Russian generals are going to get blown up outside of Moscow, and the Kremlin is going to respond by launching missiles at Kiev. And these are things that are going to be used to try to get Donald Trump to derail negotiations. And so I do think the Russians agreeing to a ceasefire here would be wise, even though I'm sure to some degree that the Ukrainians are going to use that time to rearm. Now, you bring up an interesting point there that there seem to be a lot of technical discussions to be had. Even if NATO membership is taken off the table, things like how long range weapons, missiles will Ukraine have in the long run? What's to happen with the territory that was annexed by Russia, but not even controlled by Russian forces at this point? So what are these, since you were in the diplomat service, do you know what these negotiations are going to look like? Are we looking at just hours or days and days and days of kind of technical level, working level discussions between U.S., Western diplomats and Russia to hammer this out? Or will Ukraine be involved in these talks? What's your assessment there?
I mean, I think there'll be a process that will go on for years without any resolution, to be honest. And we'll end up with some sort of frozen situation like we ended up with Transnistria in Moldova, like we've ended up in Cyprus, like we've ended up in Korea, with a demilitarized zone, and that sort of thing. And it will just become, its own kind of status quo. A format of dialogue will exist. Talks will occasionally happen. Nothing will really change. We have seen signs that the Russians are willing to accept, or showing signs they're willing to accept the fact that they won't be able to kind of take the parts of the forward blast that they haven't conquered already. Which I think is absolutely right. I think it's ridiculous on the Russian side to believe that they could actually have that as well, having not conquered it sort of militarily. Now, I think ceasefire happens. Some elements may be resolvable. Some issues around kind of minority languages, that sort of thing. Some possible movement on Ukrainian children and that sort of thing. Some possible limitations on sort of Ukrainian rearmament. But all the kind of tricky things about territorial ownership, I mean, that will very much be kicked into the very, very long grass.
I kind of think you're right about that. I just don't see the political will or motivation, particularly in the leadership of the West or in Kiev, to sit down and hammer out these negotiations with Russia. And I imagine the Kremlin's position is going to be fairly inflexible. That's not going to incentivize it either. Now, before we wrap up, I want to ask you about this really great article published on your Substack, and we will be linking to it later this week at antiwar.com, covering up the Ukrainian Nazis is nothing new. And in the article, you do a really good job of documenting the history here. But to get into the modern day, you write, I don't think that Ukraine today is a Nazi society, even its high watermark. The Sloboda Party only garnered 10% of the national vote, but ultranationalism is a major problem, particularly in west of Ukraine, in the area known as Galicia during World War II, and the refusal of Western governments to acknowledge the issue of ultranationalism in Ukraine or speak out at the means we're using that we are turning a blind eye to the activity that we would never tolerate in our own countries. And so I think it's really important that you're calling this out. This is something that a lot of people in the independent alternative media have been really highlighting since 2014, but particularly since the war got going in 2022, about that this is a major issue. All these ethno-nationalists, white supremacists in Ukraine, neo-Nazis, and our governments all said this isn't a problem, it's propaganda, this is Kremlin talking points, you're Putin's puppet if you say it, but you're laying out here that this is all true. So I guess, you know, even if it's not a Nazi dominated society, I think we've seen in many war zones across the world, take Syria for example, where there were a lot of very moderate people within the Syrian opposition to Bashar al-Assad, but the people most likely to take up guns and go to the front of the revolutions are those most ideologically driven, and those tend to be the most radical. And so in Syria, that's Al-Qaeda, and in Ukraine, it seems that a lot of the military is Azov. So I'm just curious as to you know, your assessment of how big of a problem is this in Ukraine.
I mean, I think it's a bigger issue in terms of the Ukrainian national politics than it is in Ukrainian society at large, very much so. Whenever Zelensky wants to make any concessions, as we saw in 2019 over the Minsk II agreements, and there were kind of public protests with the ultras and their kind of red and black flags and that sort of thing, I don't think it's a big issue in Ukrainian society. But these people have the power to bring, you know, protests out onto the streets with Molotov cocktails and that sort of thing. And, you know, since 2014, with the Western governments basically backing up anything that Kiev wanted to do, it's always the easy option for them not really to kind of tackle the ultra-nationalist issue head on, because they knew that the West would always kind of sponsor them in their antagonistic kind of policy towards Russia, come what may. So I think that's now that problem has become harder for Ukraine to resolve domestically, as and when war ends, when Zelensky puts himself up for re-election. You know, one of the candidates for president is Budanov, the head of military intelligence. He's well known to be an extreme ultra-nationalist. So I mean, this is what you sow what you reap when you kind of sow these seeds and don't really kind of properly kind of deal with them 11 years ago, quite frankly. So it's a big problem. And actually the point about World War II was that actually, you know, it's actually the British encouraged Commonwealth governments not to act against Nazis, people associated with the Nazi regime of Hitler, including people belonging to the kind of Ukrainian Galicia brigade, because actually, forget about Nazis, communists are our problem now. And that's what we see in Ukraine today, that because, Russia is our enemy, well, we don't need to kind of worry so much about Nazis in Ukraine. And it's that kind of weird relativism that we kind of fall into here, that suddenly we can turn a blind eye to it because we're so obsessed with this apparent big enemy that is Russia.
Right. It's quite amazing that so much, at least in the US, of the propaganda, the need to support the war in Ukraine is all centered around that Putin is the new Hitler, right? They everything is framed in the context of World War II, where, the US and somehow leaving out the Soviets, but the US and the Brits beat the Nazis and were big heroes from that. And so ever since, everywhere we go to, Saddam, Libya, whatever country we go to, Bashar al-Assad, they're all Hitler.
The big bad guy to fight. Yeah.
Exactly. And then when you actually do have Nazis, we seem to support them more often than not.
And Al-Qaeda terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, it's a terrible state of affairs.
One of the things you mentioned earlier in the interview that I want to maybe get just a few of your thoughts on as we wrap up here, and something that kind of brings it up in my mind because of this conversation, is you say Putin made a mistake, trying to take these 4 territories. And, I think we really do see one of the reasons that Putin made such a big mistake is if the government in Kiev does collapse, we now have Andrei Belitsky, one of the leaders of the Sloboda Party, a major Azov figure, not only commanding a Ukraine Ukrainian brigade, but now the Third Army Corps of that country. And so this is a major military fighting force that an avowed neo-Nazi is now the head of. And so this, I think, will be a major problem for Putin in the years to come, or whoever the next Russian leader is in the decades to come, that they've really radicalized these ultra-nationalists against the Russian state. And so what do you think are some either that problem or other problems that Putin created for himself by invading and trying to take so much of Ukrainian territory?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I think the Russian military is seeing off the Ukrainian military as it is anyway. The Ukrainian military doesn't have the resources, whether or not part of it is led by a neo-Nazi or otherwise. And I think the problem there is really for Ukrainian domestic politics itself, and the scope of some internal civil war within Ukraine. As Zelensky comes to some sort of messy end, there's some sort of power vacuum because he's impeached, and people like Poroshenko and so on, and people who basically manage armies want to fill the vacuum. I mean, that is a risk. I don't think that risk is a risk to Putin. I think it's a risk to Ukrainian domestic politics per se, and a far bigger risk to Europe than Russia itself, which is the big irony here, of course.
Absolutely. Ian, thank you so much for joining me today on the Kyle Lanslone Show. I really recommend people check out your work. I know you've been published at the Quincy Institute. That's our first about your stuff. But also subscribe to your Substack, The Peacemonger, and check out your website, The Proud Diplomat. Thank you so much for joining. Be sure to subscribe to the show, and we will see you on Wednesday at 4:45 with guest James Carden.